In his first few days in office, President Joe Biden wasted no time signing executive orders. Several of them reverse former President Donald Trump's policies, and that includes his ban on transgender people serving in the military. On your side's Kaylee Tracy spoke with a local transgender lawyer who served in the military about his reaction to President Biden's action.
What I'm doing is enabling all qualified Americans to serve their country in uniform.
With his signature,
Essentially, restoring the situation that existed before with transgender personnel.
President Joe Biden Monday repealed former President Donald Trump's ban, which prevented transgender people from openly serving in the military. Trump announced the ban in 2017 on Twitter, which itself was a reversal of former President Barack Obama's policy from 2016 that allowed transgender people to serve. The order signed by Biden also prohibits involuntary discharges on the basis of gender identity.
I'm a LGBT lawyer, transgender man myself, and so I'm very happy that my brothers and sisters in arms can now serve with some semblance of peace and concern, alleviate some concern. They're at least protected now.
Carrington Rusty Meade served as a mechanic in the Navy in the 1980s. He says Biden followed through with his pledge to reverse the ban by putting pen to paper Monday.
He's very committed to making sure that, people of diverse backgrounds are well represented in as far as having voices as it concerns implementation of policies, especially, military matters, and also making sure that only those things that truly do matter about an individual's characteristics are considered in determining whether or not they merit the ability to serve the country.
But Meade says the order does not completely eliminate concerns for transgender service members.
Military bases are not completely safe areas for all of our veterans, active duty and otherwise, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. But in some respects, this does make it a bit safer for some.
Kaylee Tracy, First Coast News, on your side.